Well, yeah, we are the University of Dayton Game Development Club. We're a group of students at the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, and we collaborate on making games for game jams, and just kind of for fun. Sometimes we work on hardware stuff. We're currently kind of in the process of building an arcade cabinet and then trying to make a fighting game for that arcade cabinet. But we're super excited to have you on. Would you just be able to do kind of a brief introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Ari. I am technically a graduate of the University of Victoria. I have a bachelor's of computer science. I have been working on my own voxel engine for the past 6 years and recently became a full-time game developer on a different project actually, but we can get into that later if you're interested. Other than that, I make some YouTube videos for fun. I think that's really all there is to it.
Yeah. Nice. Well, yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious about I mean, you touched on your educational background a little bit, but I'm curious about your kind of early career. Particularly, I saw that you potentially co-founded a studio with someone else, Effort Games.
Yeah, that is the new project I alluded to. We started a full-time studio in February of this year after getting some investment capital from an angel investor for a project that we're working on.
That's awesome. I'm kind of curious. I don't think any of us are really familiar with this type of thing. Like, what was that process like for you? I guess finding someone who is interested in something that you wanted to make, and kind of how did you present it to them? Did you need to make any demos or?
Well, the project itself had a very rough prototype before we ended up meeting them. And once we got the door open, we basically just created a pitch deck outlining our business plan, how we're planning to get revenue from the project, and our timeline. And we met in person and gave the pitch, and it seemed to go well. But as far as finding an investor goes, it's honestly really difficult. And I wish I had more concrete advice about it, but like we were looking for months for any means of funding before we found them, and it was honestly just luck. I guess the best advice that I would have for trying to find people that are interested in like investing in projects or working on a company or something like that is just to make sure that you're very present in your local community. Mainly like the more established like industry community, the people that actually have money to throw around, because the more people you know, the better chance you're going to find someone that's receptive to what you're doing.
Yeah. What I guess beyond like the funding, what was the process for making a studio? So it's you and one other person?
Yeah, my business partner's name is Brian. We met at our Game Dev Club, actually, the University of Victoria Game Dev Club. And we've known each other for about 2 years now. We created a limited liability company. I'm not sure exactly how that equates to what's in America, but it's effectively just a very low overhead business entity um, that legally distinguishes you from your business operations, which, is always a good thing when you're handling investments and large amounts of money like that. You don't necessarily want that to be tied to you directly. Um, we, I think I pitched the idea last September to him. And, we found out that our skills just really work together very well. Like, I'm very deep into engine development and programming systems. That's kind of my area of focus. And he is excellent at creating sort of like more intricate gameplay systems and creating content and making sure like a game flow works really well. And that is definitely not my strong suit. He's also excellent at the business stuff. He has education in bookkeeping and entrepreneurial stuff. Sorry. Um, and so like it clicked very well. And we quickly realized that we made a really good team and started looking more seriously, trying to figure out how we could get the project started. For a while, we were considering trying to bankroll it ourselves, but that would have taken us a fair bit longer to actually get enough money to be able to leave our day jobs and do that. And then eventually we went to PAX in Seattle, and that's where we ended up meeting a whole bunch of industry people, and that ended up being the door to actually creating our company full time.
Nice. Yeah, I've heard a lot of similar stories about like people trying to get into solo dev, like particularly like founding a studio, and it usually doesn't happen until they end up going to like GDC in San Fran or PAX or other conferences where they can actually like meet and like mingle with investors and other industry people.
Yeah, I mean, I can't stress enough how impactful going to these events has been. Like, the last September was my first PAX, and then in March, I think it was, we both went to GDC, and both of those events have just been so mind-blowing to us, more valuable than we ever could have hoped.
Nice. Yeah, when you went to GDC, did you guys just do the expo and then kind of like walk around and meet people, or did you see any of the talks?
Well, we weren't the most experienced when it came to picking out tickets, so we ended up getting, I think, the full Summits pass, which is way more expensive than you need if you actually go to GDC. Take it from me, if you're going to go there to network and see the occasional talk, just get the Indie Pass. It's like $1,500 cheaper. Um, but we went to a few summits. They were really great. I think. I expected there to be a lot more focused talks on the things that I was interested in because I've seen a lot of GDC talks online in the past, and that have like really sort of like sparked my interest. But I think that with any sort of run of GDC, you're going to get a sprinkling of really good talks and then a fair few ones that you're not particularly interested in or outside of your field. So I'd say definitely going to GDC, expect to mostly be networking, but there will be like the odd talk that seems really important and valuable. And, it's nice to be able to go to those. And from my experience, every one that we went to that I actually cared about, the Indie Pass would have let you in.
Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, do you want to share, I guess, any of your plans with the studio going forwards? I know kind of on the website it says that you guys are working on a roguelike party game.
Yeah, so it's still in very early stages, which is why I'm glad I'm not doing any screen sharing here. But our pitch is basically we're making a 4 to 8 player local multiplayer Jackbox style game where you control with your phones and like look at a big TV, where you're split into two teams or just one if you're playing co-op, where each team is controlling a mech traveling through an alien environment, trying to scavenge as much valuable material as possible. And as you go through, you fight with aliens and other robot like mech people by playing WarioWare style mini games on your phones to charge your weapons and defend and dodge. It's got a kind of turn-based combat system, sort of like Slay the Spire or Cobalt Core, but you play mini games to determine how effective you are as opposed to drawing cards.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds really cool. Are you kind of rolling a lot of custom tech for that? Are you rolling a custom engine? I know you're mostly known for a lot of your custom engine work.
Yeah, the tech stack is a little bit cursed. So I mostly run with hand-rolled C++ when I work on more intensive projects like my voxel engine. But for game jams, I've recently been exploring a really weird tech stack that is benefited from my web development experience, which is building games in React.js directly. Um, I see some smiles. React is typically used for creating websites and UIs. But when you're creating games that are very like focused on gestures and mobile type controls and touch interactions, it actually works really well for creating dynamic game environments as well. My last two Game Jam games were entirely built in React, and this project is no different. So we've basically been hand rolling everything using that stack instead of using a more traditional engine.
Yeah, I think that's pretty valid. I guess it reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you know who Ben Awad is, but I remember he made this mobile game called Void Pet, and I believe it was written in React or a web framework. And also kind of tangentially related, the game Vampire Survivors was written in JavaScript in a framework called, I think it's Phaser. So
Oh,
it's
really?
definitely, yeah, it's actually pretty common. Um,
I've had some experience with Phaser. That's really interesting.
oh, how have you had experience with Phaser?
It was mostly older projects. I think sometime in like 2021, I did a game jam in Phaser, and I had a few prototype projects I was making in it as well that never panned out. It's just cool to hear the name.
Yeah. So do you experiment with new tech during game jams a lot? Is that kind of a bridge to trying out new things for you?
Um, I think I did more when I was trying to find my footing, but I have the vice of being a little too competitive. And so now that I've found a stack that works well for me, I mostly just try to drill into that and get as competent as I can with it because I want to be able to get the most results in the least amount of time.
Yeah. Do you normally work solo on game jams?
Yeah, my favorite jam to run in is Ludum Dare because they have the compo bracket, which it forces you to be in one-player teams and also create your assets within the time frame as well. And it's also relatively short term. It's only 48 hours. And all of those things kind of mesh really well for me because I don't have like 2 weeks to throw my life into making a game. When the way I make games during game jams is basically spending like 16 hours a day at the computer. And I also like making my own assets. I know that's not a thing for everyone, and I wouldn't expect it to be, but I really like creating my own work. But because of the aforementioned competitiveness, I don't like creating assets when I know that other people are just grabbing them from the internet, and I know I'm wasting my time when I could be coding, right? So the combo works really well for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So earlier you had mentioned that you were in a game dev club at your university. I'm curious kind of what that was like and if there was anything in particular you enjoyed during your time there.
Yeah, I actually served as the club lead for a year. I just finished because I graduated. Um, Honestly, going to the UVic Game Dev Club was the most significant event in my life, I think, which sounds ridiculous. But I came from a very small town. There was only like 16,000 people, and I'm pretty sure I was the only programmer that was in my age group in the entire city. We're very skewed towards like older folks, and so th there wasn't very many people to talk to. And so I started my university during COVID. So the first year and a half or so of it was almost entirely online. I didn't really socialize with anybody outside of my existing friend group online. And so, actually going to the UVic Game Dev Club, I think in like 2022, was my first time meeting other people that shared my interests at all. And it completely opened the doors for me. It made me realize there was other people that were interested in the things I was doing. It made me realize that I could share and talk to people and like, learn from other people's experiences as well. It's just, I wouldn't even have this company if I didn't meet Brian through the club. So I can't speak to its virtues enough. It's great. I love social spaces for meeting other people that have your interests. I think university clubs are in this weird zone where not many other institutions or like areas like work or whatever can afford having interest-based groups like that because people are very busy with their own lives. And so it's super excellent to be able to find people like that are all, shared with a common interest.
Yeah, it's interesting the number of people that we've met with for these kind of interviews who have said the same thing. Like, I don't know if you know who Panos Karabellas is, but he is kind of a solo engine dev who's been working on this engine called Spartan for like 14 years. And he said the same thing. He was like, I founded a game dev club in my university and it like changed the trajectory of my life. So it's kind of an interesting like common denominator almost.
Well, I think there's a very real thing where, like, when you're in university, you're around all sorts of people that are finally figuring out what they want to spend their lives doing. And if that is game development, then they're probably a pretty good connection, you know? So I think it definitely works out like that.
Yeah. And you said you were the lead of the club for a year. Did that experience kind of give you any insight into managing people or kind of solidify anything where you're like, okay, this is definitely what I want to do?
Well, I think it solidified the fact that I don't want to manage people. Um, I before I ever went to university and before I ran the Game Dev Club, I did freelance web development for several years, and so I had direct like client to me contact a lot. And I think running the club felt somewhat similar, but multiplied by, 20 to 30 members. I mean, it's definitely a lot less adversarial because a lot of the times, like clients and you are opposed in your interests. They want more for less money. You want less time spent on their project. Whereas, when you're going to club, people are mostly unified in what they want, which is a good time. But it's still very difficult for me trying to manage expectations and coordinate and plan things. I can do it. I have the skill set, but it's definitely not something that I really prefer to do if I can avoid it.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious also, I guess at what point in your education or I guess early life did you get into engine dev and kind of how did that lead you into doing these YouTube videos about engine development?
Well, I knew I wanted to make a game from scratch when I was like 11. I think that some people are just born with the brain worms that don't let them want to use anything else that already exists. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, but here I am. But I didn't actually get into like fully committing until I think I just turned 17. It was around 2018. And I started Zepha, my engine project in yeah, that was I started it in C++ at the beginning of 2018. Um yeah, sorry, the timeline's a little bit fuzzy for me, but I guess I've been working on it for about 6 years now.
Yeah, that's really cool. I guess how did you kind of get into sharing stuff about Zepha and programming in general on YouTube and social media?
Well, I guess that's probably where a bit of pragmatism comes in. I realized that if I ever wanted to make a profit off of creating a thing, then I'd have to actually, get it out there and start publishing content about it so that people can know it exists. That's not to say there wasn't like interest in the idea of creating YouTube videos. I think that like probably most people in my generation that were very on the internet, when I was very young, I did want to be a gaming YouTuber. I wanted to be a Let's Player of Minecraft, which thankfully was not what I ended up doing. But I've always enjoyed the idea of creating video content and sharing it with people. And once I got so absorbed into programming and making an engine and I think that like we've kind of had a resurgence of dev content on the platform in the last 3 or 4 years. It kind of just felt like it matched up really nicely. I was like, I can make videos on what I'm already interested in. And, there's an audience for that now.
Yeah. How do you balance kind of doing the technical work with the effort that it takes to kind of package it into a video and share it? Because I know it takes a lot of effort.
Well, I don't think I balance it all that well. If you look at my videos, most of them have like a 7 to 9 month gap between them. I think that if I can slightly tangent and talk about the perils of trying to map out time, the way that I usually do it is I create a video and then I go, okay, well, it's been about 2 months since I've made the last one, so I guess I should start thinking about making another one. And then, everything gets in the way, life gets in the way. It's so easy to lose sight of something that you want to do that isn't immediately sort of time bounded, and then, 2 months turns into four, turns into seven, and now you're like, oh, okay, it's been more than half a year since I've published. People are going to think I'm dead. So, I usually get to a point where I'm like, okay, this is actually bad. I need to make something. And then I try to commit like 2 weeks of my life to just grinding out something that is presentable and that I like. And I think that time pressure is what finally pushes me to make a new video of something. Which I guess is to say it really doesn't come naturally to me to focus on making content. I always feel like what I have is just about good enough to show, but then by the time where it actually would be good enough to show, I've already started focusing on the next thing that doesn't feel ready, and that's where my focus is. I've been working on trying to get some more sort of external pressure for creating content. I want to not be in this cycle, but I haven't really mastered that yet.
Yeah. I guess now that you're kind of working in this studio environment, like how does that affect your plans going forwards with YouTube and with Zepha? Like, has this changed at all?
Well, I mean, I did want to create, I think, more videos this year, although I'm not convinced that if I hadn't started this project, I would have. The most recent video I uploaded a couple weeks ago was mainly finally motivated by the fact that Brian and I really wanted to get a video out about our new project because we wanted to, leverage the audience, get people to know the project existed. But I had promised in my last video, 9 months old now, that my next video was going to be about, instancing and indirect rendering. And I did want to make that video, but I think left to my own devices, I might have waited a lot longer to do it. Whereas, Brian and I spoke and we were like, okay, I don't feel comfortable not releasing this video next because people have been waiting for a potentially really long time now, and we want to release a different video about our stuff, so I got to get this one done. And thankfully he was very understanding of that. He recognizes that, like creating stuff for people to see is just another vector of getting our names out there. So he set me loose to go and work on that for a couple of weeks, and I'm very happy with the result. But I guess, yeah, in the current time, I'd say that the videos that I'm creating are a lot more motivated by what we like the timeline is motivated by what we need. I initially thought that after releasing that video, I was going to work on the project for a couple of weeks because we had a few more features that we needed to have in the engine so that Brian could do his thing and work on game content. And then I was going to go immediately into making that next video about Stardust Frontier, our project. But then we ended up realizing that some of our deadlines are nearing a lot sooner than we thought. So now I'm working on that. And, that video might end up getting pushed back a month or two.
So when you say deadlines, is that kind of obligations to the investors in your studio?
Not this time actually. We're gonna be exhibiting at PAX West this September, and so we
Oh,
need to have
nice.
a functional prototype that actually looks good and plays good for then.
What's the overall timeline for this game, Stardust Frontier?
Well, our rough roadmap spanned about a year from when we started in February to when we were hoping to be ready for early access. I think the time is a little bit fuzzy because, as you go, there's always unforeseen circumstances that occur. But I don't think that we're particularly behind. I think we're pretty close to our estimated pace. So we're hoping for quarter one or early quarter two, 2026 for an early access release.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really exciting. I guess I'm curious a little bit about like working with someone else compared to working solo on jams. Have you found kind of a different workflow? How do you effectively work with someone else on kind of a shared vision on a game like this?
That's a great question, and something that I feel like I've only recently discovered for myself because of this project. For most of my time, I've only really worked on things solo, and so I was a bit anxious about working with a team because I don't really consider myself much of a team player, but it's honestly been really nice working with Brian, and I think that's mainly because we have different areas which we work best in. I'd say that it's very difficult to productively work on a project, even if it's a large project, if everyone has the same skill set and interests, because you're going to end up stepping on each other's toes. Like sometimes when you're building a huge project, you might need multiple programmers, but for something that's like the scope of an indie game, it's often nice to kind of dial in the core engine with one person's vision, or like, at least one person's code, and then have like other people, if they're developing, sort of hook onto that more than trying to like implement features on their own, which might not match the code style and might have like weird inconsistent APIs because they're not the same as you did it. I think that, with Brian mostly focusing on content and art and business stuff right now, and me mostly focusing on coding, it works pretty well for our separation of responsibilities. I think communication is one of those things that also plays into that. I was very worried when we started that communication was going to be a major holdup because, it can be very difficult to like have your expectations line up when you've all got like different ideas of the game in your head that you want to kind of merge into this nicer whole. And we've definitely had our moments where, we're like, oh, wait, you wanted the system to be turn-based? I thought this was going to be like, real time or something where like it ends up sparking a day or two long discussion. But For the most part, I think we've been managing it pretty well. And I think it really just comes down to making an effort to speak with each other as much as we can about what's in our head. Because, I think so when you're working on the same thing, what's in your mind isn't just what it is now, it's what you think it will become. And it can be really easy to trick yourself into thinking that you're seeing the same thing as someone else. But because so much of it in your mind is not there yet, it can end up diverging quite a lot. And I think the most important thing with that is to actually voice what you're expecting the project to be in the future so that you know what those differences are and figure out how to unify them.
Yeah. So you would say the biggest thing is kind of frequent and clear communication to make sure that everyone that's working on the same thing has kind of a shared vision and everyone is kind of in the same line?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but I do think that's the most important part.
No, I think that's pretty relevant. I mean, we recently did a game jam. It was called the Isekai Horror Game Jam, and we made a visual novel, and it was kind of satisfying, like during our early meetings and ideation stages, where like maybe I had an idea for something, and Dan was someone who worked on this game. Actually, everyone in this call worked on this game, but maybe I had an idea of how something was meant to be done or should be done, and Dan had a different idea of how it was meant to be done, and then kind of just like talking with each other long enough, we just iron out everything, and then it's like at the end, it's like we both see the same thing. It's like, aha, like we both get it. So I don't think it's a cop-out answer. I think it's probably the correct answer, at least in my empirical experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ryan here because being able to talk with a whole team, because especially from for you, uh, you seem like you had a lot of experience by yourself, uh, making personal projects throughout college, because and then having that moment of being able to work with other people is just so different. Because I want to ask you. Like normally when people go through college, they normally dream about joining a company, a big company, you know, big game studios. But you decided to do just co-found with one other guy. And like personally, why did you decide to do indie games instead of just going the normal path of just joining like a big game company?
Well, I think for better or for worse, I never really considered joining a large company an option. The thing that motivated me to explore game development was so individually focused. I had a specific vision of a game I wanted to make, and that's what compelled me to learn everything I did. And so I never really thought that working in a larger company would afford me the creative control that I wanted in what I was doing. There was a very long time where I thought that if I joined a real company, my life would effectively be over. Like I'd just end up getting complacent in like, working for a team, like doing something that I'm not necessarily interested in, and then I would effectively stagnate for the rest of my life. And I actually avoided working for any sort of established company like the plague for a lot of my high school and university, which is why I ended up doing so much freelance web development to make money. That pattern was eventually broken when I got a job offer very directly. I got kind of headhunted from some experience I had at university for a local company, and I did end up going to work there because the realities of the fact that I was about to be done university and I needed money were kind of staring me in the face. Um, and thankfully, I feel like that worry about stagnation was mostly in my head. Um, because I worked there for 8 months and the whole time I was like, okay, yes, I want to leave now. So I would have worked there longer if I hadn't gotten the investment opportunity, but my plan was to reassess in a couple years and like see based on how much savings I had and like what I expected my timeline for Zepha to be. I was going to potentially leave at that point to work on it full time. This has just kind of been an interesting sidestep of my plan.
I see that's really cool because if do you think you would have started your indie game company as soon as you did if you'd never met Brian?
I don't think I would have started a company. I think I would have kept working as an individual, and eventually tried to commercialize on that. And I'm really glad I didn't. There are so many intricacies to managing like a company and managing intellectual property and, revenue and taxation and stuff that I have no experience about. And I kind of hoped that, alone I would just bumble my way through it and be fine. And I'm very happy that I don't have to because of Brian's experience. Um, I do think that I would have, like, if I hadn't met Brian, and I had enough money to start working on Zepha full time, that is what I would have done once I finished university. Ideally immediately, but I probably would have worked at a place for a little while to get some runway so I could personally fund myself while not also having a day job. Um, and then I would have worked up to publishing on my own. But yeah, I mean, I'm much happier with this path.
Yeah, that's really awesome. For you to be able to meet somebody perfect for you and then just blow up into exactly what you wanted. That's so awesome. And so
I,
uh, uh so as a indie game, so now that you have to start branching out to the marketing aspect of like you mentioned earlier. So for individuals like us, what would you recommend when it comes to like maybe getting ourselves out there on social media? Like, because you started YouTube that you're talking about. Because I saw you have some other social media. What type of things do you post on there, and what type of cool things that do you use to market yourself? Because clearly you ended up here. So
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. Thank you for offering to interview me as well. This is super cool. This is the first time I've done something like this. But I guess speaking on creating like a sort of social media presence and getting yourself out there. I got some advice recently that would have been nice to know a couple years ago, because I accidentally ended up starting to do it on my own now, but I definitely wasn't doing it the whole time, that I think that holds very true, which is that when you're an individual or a very small team and you're trying to get a foothold on the internet, don't try to do everything at once. Like basically experiment until you find the platforms that are receptive to you and then drill into those specifically. When I started working on Zepha, I was trying to post on every platform. I was creating like short form content for Twitter and Mastodon. I was creating like posts on Reddit that were long form articles and cross posting them to Tumblr. I was doing basically everything except YouTube actually, because is kind of, I think, writing is more of my comfort zone. Like actually reading something out loud and producing a video is a lot more, it has a lot more friction for me. And I wasn't really getting any response to any of those places, probably because I wasn't committing to any of them. And I was just kind of like half-assedly cycling through all of the different options, trying to, just get everywhere at once. And I do wish that I'd tried YouTube earlier because my first YouTube video that I uploaded, I think it got like 3,000 views in the first week. And then, it's gone on to unfortunately be my most popular video because I hate it. I hate that video so much now. But it's got almost 50,000 views. And I guess like I don't necessarily think that it's always a slow rise on a platform. Like I think there's this mentality where people are like, okay, well if you get like 5 likes on Blue Sky today, if you post once a day for a year, then you'll have, 500 likes within a year. But I don't think that it's necessarily so linear or predictable. I think a lot of it is finding the right audience fit. Like YouTube is where my audience is because my content is very visual and, I can create visualizations and I can show the game very directly. It's kind of like a presentation. Whereas text-based stuff, I think, would work better if I had more polished clips to show, but it's hard to convey more like deep information at this stage of development through it, while also holding people's attention. Um, and I guess like I'm not necessarily saying that YouTube is the right option for everyone starting out a project, but I'm mostly saying that it's important to try all of the different options and figure out which one is the right option for you. Because hopefully, if you do that, you cycle, through the options once or twice, you will get something that immediately speaks out to you as like, oh, maybe this didn't go viral, but that's like 10 times the views I get anywhere else, right? and then you kind of know what to focus on.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So thank you for answering my question. I'm
Yeah, no
gonna pass it
problem.
on to somebody else.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as someone who works on, I have my own custom engine that I've been working on for like 2 years, and I know that it's kind of like a lot of work. And sometimes when I make games on it, it even stresses me out a little bit, or I'm like, how am I going to make this game? Because I have to do it on this stack that I've already made, and sometimes you have to add new features and change things, and sometimes maybe like the fundamental approach that you had done to something in the past is like incompatible with what you want to build on top of it. So I'm curious, like, as someone who has these kind of stakes of is building a game and is also building the engine, which requires all of this effort, how do you kind of balance that? How do you balance the effort between the engine and the game? And are there any caveats that come along with it?
Yeah, I think that there's like an important sort of constraint to my engine, which is that I am building it entirely for the purpose of making voxel environments. And that was honestly probably the motivating factor to creating my own engine in the first place, is that traditional engines like Unity or Unreal or, Godot aren't particularly optimized for that sort of content. It's very specialized how you need to represent it and render it and like process it. Um, I think that when you create a more general engine, it's quite difficult to create the sort of API surface and capabilities that you'd necessarily want if you were just trying to focus on building a game. Um, which, I'm also not alone, or I'm not isolated from myself either, because although I only have to worry about voxels, I am trying to make an engine that handles everything that I'd want to do with voxels, which is a pretty wide space. Um, I think right now my time is mostly dedicated entirely to engine development. Any content that I make is mainly for the purpose of testing if the engine's working properly. And a little bit of it is that so that the game looks presentable so I can show it online without people being like, what is this? Like untextured cubes? Um, I think if your aim is to build an engine and then build games in it, I'd highly recommend trying to like dial in specifically what games you want to make and focus your engine endeavors on the things that you would need to make that work. Because, it's very compelling to try to make like the perfect system that can handle anything. But a lot of the time you'll get much better results if you like focus a little more on like, I want this to be an engine for like first person games or 2D platformers or something, and you can build a lot more convenience functions for that. And then if you want to create something different, chances are that you can just sort of like take the same base and expand it out to add more functionality later for a different genre.
Yeah. I think as a programmer, I kind of struggle a little bit with like over scoping. Sometimes I get caught up in building a system like in my engine and I'm just like, let me just do the whole thing or add like 10 things to it and add all these like complexity when in reality I probably don't need to do all of it. So I think that's really relevant. Was that kind of something you learned through experience? Did you spend, I don't know, part of your development time on past projects like overscoping, and then that was what made you realize, like, okay, I really need to dial it in?
Yeah, definitely. I think like Zepha's been through a number of very like significant refactors, and a lot of the time those refactors have been driven by I wrote code that was supposed to be too general, and now it was way too unwieldy to work with. Because I think honestly the biggest reason not to overscope early on is because until you have something more concrete, it's hard to actually know what you need. Um, when you're looking at it all in concept and you're just looking at, oh, I want a system to handle blocks and blocks can render differently and I want them to be able to do stuff when I hit them or do stuff on their own or whatever you want. It's easy to create a model in your head that doesn't actually align with how you're going to use it. And I think that that's exacerbated when you try to make a perfectly, like, broadly encompassing solution before you start actually writing anything in it. So now what I try to do a bit more is I start with a sort of almost a case study of a feature I want to work in my system. And then I write down all of the mechanics I'm going to need to make it work. And then I take a step and I look at those mechanics and I think, okay, is there something that I could do to these that would make them more general without necessarily increasing the code surface that much or decreasing the usability of it for this specific case? And if I can do that, then I try to generalize it. And then I sort of go and I try to implement that. And even if that has to be revised later, it's easier because there's less unused code that's like bouncing around from trying to create it perfectly the first time. And so I think it's not that I'm trying to not refactor stuff in the future, because I know that I'm going to need to change things and alter the design as I go forward and realize there's new constraints and requirements. But I'm trying to make the work that I've done already be a lot more concrete in the areas that I know I'm going to need so that the refactors are smaller and have to manage less dead code.
Yeah. On the topic of, I guess, refactoring and engine development, um, you mentioned earlier that kind of off-the-shelf engines like Unity or Unreal are maybe not the most suited for voxel games or voxel-based games, particularly because they're not optimized for these data structures. Is there any kind of interesting techniques or optimization techniques that you have to employ in Zepha?
Well, I guess if I was to think about probably the most esoteric part of my code base, it would have to be the lighting system. The entire thing is entirely, I guess, like bit shifting and binary mathematics. I do something called word level parallelism, which is effectively a form of single instruction multiple data, where you do operations on multiple numbers at once in a single operation by packing multiple numbers into a single 64-bit integer. Because my lighting, it has 9 color channels. It's got red, green, and blue for block light, and then 2 red, green, and blues for sunlight because of a technical detail that, would be a bit of a tangent to get into. And so I pack, I think they're like 5-bit numbers into one large U64. And then by masking out specific digits in between and doing some specific operations, you can actually sum both like two numbers in that format together and perform operations on all 9 of the numbers at once in one primitive, like, addition operation on the CPU. And the code looks slightly horrifying. It's definitely not very readable, and I'd say it's probably about 50% comments to try and make up for that. But it's definitely, I think, the most optimized part of the code base to date. And that sort of thing would be pretty hard to do in any language that doesn't get compiled straight down into assembly, which, I think Unity primarily uses C Sharp. I think Unreal works in C++, but that's not the main language you're supposed to use, if I understand correctly. And Godot does support C++, but it ends up casting it all back up into its Pythonic types. Like everything in the Godot engine is heap allocated and memory managed, and it sends it to you in C++ that way, and then you have to return it that way. So making very optimized code that works on like a binary level isn't particularly effective because of all that overhead. Um, and so I guess like, being able to work in a language where I know like exactly what I write is going to predictably be executed as raw assembly instructions that I can even like throw my code into a compiler and look at what those are is really nice for trying to write very heavily optimized code.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You brought up SIMD, which for those in the call is single instruction, multiple data. It's kind of like an instruction set for CPUs that lets you work on kind of data in parallel. And it's like a really efficient pipeline. I'm curious because things like SIMD are not supported on a lot of platforms or CPUs, or they're supported in different contexts. How do you kind of target multiple platforms? Are there platforms that you, when you're writing your engine, don't care about or necessarily implement differently?
Well, so the benefit of the lighting system is that word level parallelism doesn't actually require any hardware level SIMD, because it ultimately is packing multiple digits into a single regular integer that any CPU can handle. But I do use some actual SIMD, although that's mostly relegated to just libraries that have done all the hard work for me. Like my world generation ultimately depends very heavily on this library called Fast Noise 2. which is a C++ library that implements pretty much every different SIMD format and dynamically switches on them based on compiler support. And it exposes like a node-based architecture for actually plugging in the different noise modules together. And it allows it to be highly optimized without me having to write like 15 different implementations. That said, from my understanding, I think at least like 4U32 value SIMD is supported pretty often among most CPUs nowadays. So if you're targeting relatively recent hardware because you need like a good GPU or whatever, it can usually be pretty safe to have at least some of it in your project. You just can't necessarily do anything crazy with like 256 byte or like bit registers.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you use a lot of libraries when you're rolling your engines, or are there some things that you think it's better to write yourself?
I try to keep it mostly pretty bare bones. I use a library for coherent noise because I do not have that sort of knowledge to make that myself. Um, and I use a library for networking because I think nowadays with how complicated networking is, it would be pretty foolish to try to write like a raw TCP or UDP layer for your game. I use a library for managing windowing and input. I use SDL because like ultimately those things are very like basically I guess what I should actually say is I use libraries for things that are going to be operating system specific or just very mathematically complex without much degree of creativity in them. But if there's something where if I code it, I can bring something unique to the table that might specifically help my project, I try very hard to write that myself.
Yeah. I'm curious. We used SDL kind of indirectly through my engine for this last game jam, and I had just bumped it from SDL2 to SDL3. So I was curious if you which version you're working with and if you've tried out SDL3.
I'm currently using SDL2. I'm scared to upgrade because I know their APIs are very different. I do plan on upgrading to SDL3 before my game releases, but given that's probably a couple years out still, I don't need to worry about that right now. Is it better?
I would say it's I would say it's better in that they offer new APIs that make some things less of a pain. Like the overall API is still very similar, except I think the only thing that's really changed is if you use SDL renderer, it's actually using SDL GPU in like under the hood.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of stuff like SDL like file picker, like inside of SDL now you can spawn like windows to select files. There's like a SDL storage backend, and then SDL GPU is kind of like a higher level abstraction on top of like Vulkan and OpenGL and DirectX, which kind of bridges the gap between like writing these graphics API specific code yourself, and then using something like that's way more abstracted like SDL renderer. But I would say it's pretty nice. As far as like porting, my experience was it wasn't that bad. They have a lot of tools and scripts that you can run that will change all of the syntax, like all of the API names that have changed. You can run a script and it'll do like it'll patch it basically to be the new signatures. It's not that hard.
That's good to hear. I don't use their rendering backend. I write my graphics just in Vulkan directly. I mainly use it for windowing and input, and I'm hoping to use it for audio as well when I eventually get to that system. So hopefully that means that I won't have to mess with too much to get it working in the new version.
Yeah, I don't know. Are you using SDL Mixer?
For audio?
Yeah.
I haven't worked with audio at all yet. It's
Okay.
on my to-do list, but it's pretty low priority right now, which is mainly just because I can't really author my own sound effects. I have no skills in that area, so if I can't get good sounds, I don't really see much point of putting any sounds in just yet. So
Yeah. There SDL3 came out for like the main repo, but a lot of the satellite libraries like SDL Image, SDL TTF, SDL Mixer are still kind of slowly being bumped to SDL3, and I think Mixer is like the last one where they want to rewrite it before they say like this is SDL Mixer 3. So maybe the timing will work out. They'll they'll
Yeah,
have some brand new API like just in time for you to use it.
hopefully.
Cool. Well, yeah, kind of some other general questions. What do you like to do for fun outside of game dev? And kind of do you draw inspiration from that into your professional work?
Um, I do think I have a bit of a curse where my hobbies are my career, but I think when I'm not developing, I do, of course, like playing video games. I've been playing a lot of a Minecraft mod pack called Create Above and Beyond recently, which I've just been having a lot of fun with. It's like a very heavy automation focused pack. I think that speaks to my systems brain. I like creating really complex pipelines that do what they're supposed to do automatically and then figuring out where the bottlenecks are and stuff. It's very similar to Factorio or Satisfactory if you've played either of those. But outside of, I guess, video games and computer stuff, I really like writing. I've written fiction for many years. I've not ever like published anything because that's terrifying. But I do like writing and exploring ideas more on paper. I think very early on in my life, before I realized that I could make video games and interactive media, I actually wanted to be an author. So, I think storytelling is something that I care about regardless of the medium. It's just that video games, I think, speak to me more mechanically. But writing is also really fun and a lot less technical when I don't want to look at any more code for a day.
Yeah, I definitely get the sentiment of like public, like sharing it online would be scary, but I'm kind of curious how, like, what the parallels are to like you posting YouTube videos because I feel like that's also kind of like a vulnerable thing. It's kind of like embarrassing a little bit.
It is. It definitely is. I think for me, when I write videos, it's mostly that I am presenting myself in a very concrete way that I'm trying to express. It's easy to write a script, or I shouldn't say easy because I do still struggle with it, but it's easier to write a script that I'm supposed to be speaking because it's like a conversation in a sense. Whereas writing is quite scary because I think a lot of a writer's soul and desires and wishes and hopes and dreams go into the page. Even if you're typically not writing just about yourself, but the way that you view the world and the things that you want sort of frame the narratives that you write. And I almost think it's somehow easier to read into an author via fiction they've written than via like articles that they've written. And, it's not like I'm necessarily scared of people reading into me in that way. It's just if they do, I want it to be as good as it can be. I want to make sure that I'm presenting myself properly.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think there's also a component of something similar in publishing games. I guess maybe for like Stardust Frontier, it's not a direct one-to-one with writing, but I imagine like publishing kind of like a story-based or like a very personal, like deep solo game can be kind of the same feeling. It's just kind of hard to like share something with the world, especially if you're putting a lot of yourself in it.
Yeah, I think for Stardust Frontier, I'm not as worried about that for the narrative side because it's very much a collaborative effort between Brian and I, and so because it's sort of a combination of, I guess, our narrative standards and expectations. It's less like it's bearing my soul onto the page. But I do have a fairly complex narrative planned for Zeus, the game I want to make in my voxel engine, and I'm a little concerned. I'm a little fearful, that it's, going to be read into and I'm going to be seen, if that makes sense. Like it's it's interesting because it's not like I'm necessarily worried about being seen poorly. It's sort of like it feels like a step where once you put yourself out in that way, you can't necessarily stop the analysis or the understanding of you that you've created. It kind of gets a life of its own. And that's what I'm a little afraid of.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. When I think about like media that I personally enjoy, it's usually always like the authenticity of the media is kind of the author's vulnerability. So like when you consume something and it's like, wow, this feels very authentic, I can resonate with this, it's usually because the author is able to be vulnerable and put so much of themselves in something that it's like it resonates with the people who consume it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. All of my favorite media is media where you can feel like you can understand the author's self behind it.
Yeah. I don't know. Is there any media that is relevant to you that's kind of like, I don't know, sticks with you as like super inspirational or kind of like drives the work that you do?
That's a good question. There's something that's on the tip of my tongue. Just give me 1 second
Yeah,
to
no
try to
worries.
think about it. It's something that I watched recently. Um, sorry. Uh, no, I think at least for games and books, I feel like I really like narratives that explore a kind of transformation of self. I like narratives where I guess you sort of the protagonist or the character within it discovers a new lens to look at their own life. Maybe that's like a, a literal change in themselves, or maybe it's a change in the way they see the world. I think, yeah, narratives where you kind of realize you're actually a different person than you thought you were initially are very like close to my heart. I, it's funny, I'm struggling to think of any specific existing examples of that, but yeah, I guess like that's sort of like the way that I try to design my narratives as well, and it's something that kind of interests me a lot.
Yeah. I enjoy kind of the same thing. I'm kind of a nerd. That just makes me think of like Evangelion is like a 90s anime. Pretty similar. But but yeah, I guess kind of to push towards wrapping up a little bit, do you have any kind of general advice for someone who's like just like kind of like barely our senior, I guess, advice for us kind of wrapping up our last year of college and kind of going out into the world?
I guess the biggest piece of advice I would say is don't hold back. Like video games and programming in general is so much a world about who you are and what you've done, even more so than necessarily what degree you have or what credentials you have. When you meet other people that are in the industry in a place that you want to be, I think the best thing you can do to justify your existence as someone that's also, worth talking to and interesting and, like that you could be friends with is to really like be upfront about the things you care about and be upfront about the things you've done. A lot of people kind of distill that down into have a good portfolio, but I think that they're kind of missing the actual importance of the motivation behind that, which is that, if you just have a portfolio of a bunch of stuff that like is cookie cutter like things, that's not necessarily going to do much for you. People like to see you in it. I guess that kind of goes back to like the authorship thing. But like the best opportunities I've ever gotten have been because someone's seen something that I've done on the internet that I'm actually proud of and then been like, wow, that's cool. I wouldn't have expected someone to make that. Or you speak to someone and they have this niche interest and you're able to respond back with a niche interest of your own. Like I think something that I struggled with a little bit when I went to PAX and GDC was I didn't want to talk about myself too much because I didn't want to feel like I was taking up too much of other people's time with my own interests. But when I look back on it, the most enjoyment I had at those events was when someone else would go really deep into one of their interests and I'd be able to hear about it from them. So I think that like it's really important to, I guess, present yourself and your own interests in your interactions that you have with other people, because that's, I guess, ultimately what distinguishes human beings from each other, is what you care about and what you're interested in. And I think it helps a lot with, making more connections that last.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same as media. It's like the authenticity, the way that you present yourself. If you present yourself authentically, like people know and I guess kind of I don't know. It makes it easier to connect with other people.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm just gonna open it back up basically to everyone else in the call if there's any questions before we close. Okay. Well, yeah, Ari, thank you so much for coming on. It was really awesome to have you. It's super cool to hear about everything that you've been up to. Yeah, I wish you the best of luck with Stardust Frontier and all your future endeavors.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was a really cool experience. And yeah, I wish you the best of luck with your engine as well. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks so much. See ya.
See ya.